The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant William Thompson adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day of royal duties. At 52 years old, Thompson had served the royal family for over 2 decades, witnessing countless formal ceremonies, state visits, and private family moments. His weathered hands, marked by years of military service before joining the Royal Guard, smoothed the red fabric of his tunic with practiced precision. Thompson had been assigned to Prince George's security detail for the past 3 years, watching the young prince grow from a curious 8-year-old into the thoughtful 11-year-old he had become. The assignment was considered an honor among the guards, though it came with unique challenges that differed vastly from protecting adult royals. Children, especially royal children, required a different approach entirely. The castle buzzed with its usual morning activity as staff prepared for the day ahead. Prince George was scheduled for his weekly riding lesson at 10 o'clock, followed by a private tutoring session in the afternoon. These routine activities had become second nature to Thompson, who had memorized every detail of the young prince's schedule, every potential security concern, and every escape route should an emergency arise. As Thompson made his way through the familiar corridors, he reflected on how much the role had changed him. Before joining the royal household, he had been a by-the-book soldier, following orders without question and maintaining strict professional boundaries. Working with children, however, had softened some of his harder edges, while still maintaining the vigilance required for royal protection. The other guards often joked that Thompson had become something of a grandfather figure, though he would never admit it openly. He had noticed small things about Prince George that others might miss. The way the boy's shoulders would tense when photographers were around, how his eyes would light up when discussing his favorite books, or how he would unconsciously fidget with his sleeve when feeling overwhelmed by formal occasions. Prince George himself had grown comfortable with Thompson's presence over the years. Unlike some guards who maintained rigid formality, Thompson had developed a way of being protective without being intrusive, present without being overbearing. The young prince had even begun to seek out Thompson's reassuring presence during particularly challenging royal events. That morning, however, something felt different in the castle atmosphere. Thompson couldn't quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way certain staff members avoided eye contact, or the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached. His military instincts, honed by years of service, told him that change was coming, though he had no idea what form it might take. As he took his position outside Prince George's private study, Thompson allowed himself a moment to appreciate the privilege of his role. Not many people got to witness the daily life of future kings, to see the humanity behind the crown, or to play a small part in shaping the character of someone who would one day lead a nation. These thoughts, which had become more frequent lately, filled him with both pride and a strange sense of anticipation. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his musings, and Thompson straightened into his formal stance, ready to begin another day of service. Little did he know that the events about to unfold would not only change his own life forever, but also reveal the remarkable character of the young prince he had grown to respect and, in his own quiet way, care for deeply. The morning light continued to stream through the tall windows, illuminating the portraits of past monarchs that lined the walls, silent witnesses to centuries of royal history. Today they would observe a moment that, while small in the grand scope of royal affairs, would prove to be profound in its simplicity and genuine human connection. Thompson checked his watch. 9:30. In 30 minutes, Prince George would emerge for his riding lesson, and the day would officially begin. He had no way of knowing that before the day ended, everything he thought he understood about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service would be forever changed by the wordless wisdom of an 11-year-old prince. The heavy wooden door of Prince George's study opened precisely at 9:30, just as Thompson had expected. The young prince emerged, dressed in his riding attire, polished boots, cream-colored jodhpurs, and a navy blazer that bore the subtle insignia of his position. What Thompson noticed immediately, however, was something different in the boy's demeanor. Prince George moved more slowly than usual, his typical youthful energy subdued by something weighing on his young mind. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thompson said with his customary respectful nod. Prince George paused, looking up at the guard with an expression that seemed far too serious for an 11-year-old. "Good morning, Sergeant Thompson," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual brightness. The boy's eyes, normally quick and curious, seemed to be studying Thompson with unusual intensity, as if trying to memorize every detail of his face. As they walked toward the stables, Thompson noticed that Prince George kept glancing at him sideways, opening his mouth as if to say something, then closing it again. This behavior was unusual for the prince, who had always been articulate and direct in his communications. The young royal seemed to be wrestling with words that wouldn't come. The path to the stables wound through the castle's meticulously maintained gardens, where autumn flowers still bloomed despite the approaching winter. Normally, Prince George would point out interesting plants or ask questions about the gardening process. But today he remained silent, lost in thought. His small hands were clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Thompson of the boy's grandfather, King Charles, during moments of deep contemplation. When they reached the stables, Margaret, the head groom, was waiting with Prince George's horse, a gentle chestnut mare named Buttercup. The horse had been specially chosen for the young prince because of her calm temperament and patient nature. As Prince George approached Buttercup, the mare nickered softly in recognition, nuzzling the boy's shoulder with familiar affection. "She's always happy to see you, Your Highness," Margaret observed with a warm smile. Prince George nodded, stroking the horse's neck with gentle, practiced movements. "She's a good friend," he said quietly, then added with unexpected emotion, "Sometimes the best friends are the ones who understand you without words." Thompson felt a strange chill at these words, though he couldn't explain why. There was something prophetic in the boy's statement, something that seemed to carry more weight than a simple observation about horses. The young prince continued to pat Buttercup, but his eyes drifted back to Thompson with that same intense, almost sad expression. During the riding lesson, Prince George performed his usual exercises with mechanical precision, but the joy he typically found in riding seemed absent. He guided Buttercup through the required paces, walking, trotting, and controlled cantering, but his movements lacked the enthusiasm that usually characterized his time in the saddle. Even Margaret noticed the change, exchanging concerned glances with Thompson. As the lesson concluded, Prince George dismounted and spent extra time with Buttercup, whispering something into the horse's ear that neither Thompson nor Margaret could hear. The intimacy of the moment felt private, sacred even, and both adults instinctively stepped back to give the prince space. When Prince George finally rejoined them, Thompson noticed that the boy's eyes were slightly red, though no tears had fallen. The young prince maintained his composure with the dignity that had been instilled in him since birth, but the emotional strain was evident to those who knew him well. "Shall we return to the castle, Your Highness?" Thompson asked gently. Prince George nodded, but as they began walking back, he suddenly stopped. "Sergeant Thompson," he said, his young voice carrying a weight that seemed far beyond his years. "Yes, Your Highness?" The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for someone so young. "Do you believe that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do?" Thompson was taken aback by the question's depth and the serious manner in which it was asked. "I do, Your Highness. Often the most important decisions require the greatest courage." Prince George nodded slowly, as if Thompson's answer had confirmed something he already knew. "Thank you," he said simply, then continued walking toward the castle in thoughtful silence. The return journey felt different from the walk to the stables. There was a sense of finality in the air, though Thompson couldn't understand why. Prince George seemed to be saying goodbye to familiar sights. The garden fountain where he sometimes fed the birds, the ancient oak tree he loved to climb, the stone benches where he often sat to read. As they approached the castle's main entrance, Prince George turned to Thompson one last time. "You've been very kind to me, Sergeant Thompson. I want you to know that I notice kindness and I remember it." The words were spoken with such sincerity and unexpected maturity that Thompson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It has been my honor to serve you, Your Highness." Prince George smiled then, the first genuine smile Thompson had seen from him all morning. It was a smile that seemed to carry both sadness and hope, innocence and wisdom. "Honor?" the boy repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I think you understand honor very well, Sergeant Thompson." With that cryptic statement, Prince George entered the castle, leaving Thompson standing in the courtyard with a growing sense that something significant was about to unfold. though he had no idea what form it would take. The afternoon brought an unusual summons that would change everything. Thompson was called to the private office of Sir Edmund Hartley, the deputy master of the household, a man whose stern demeanor and unwavering dedication to royal protocol had earned him both respect and fear among the staff. The office, lined with leather-bound books and portraits of past royal household members, felt unusually oppressive as Thompson entered. "Please sit down. Sergeant Thompson," Sir Edmund said, gesturing to a chair across from his imposing mahogany desk. His voice carried none of its usual warmth, and Thompson immediately sensed that this was not a routine meeting. Thompson remained standing, as was proper protocol when meeting with senior household staff. "I prefer to stand, sir." Sir Edmund nodded, acknowledging the formal correctness of Thompson's response. "Very well. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you." He paused, adjusting the papers on his desk with unnecessary precision, a gesture Thompson recognized as a sign of discomfort. "There has been an incident involving your conduct while on duty," Sir Edmund continued, his words measured and careful. "A complaint has been filed regarding inappropriate familiarity with Prince George. The allegation suggests that you have overstepped the boundaries of your professional role." Thompson felt the blood drain from his face. In over 20 years of service, his conduct had never been questioned. "Sir, I can assure you that I have always maintained the highest standards of professionalism." "I understand this comes as a shock," Sir Edmund said, though his tone suggested he was reciting from a script, rather than speaking from personal conviction. "The complaint indicates that you have developed an inappropriately personal relationship with the young prince, engaging in conversations and interactions that go beyond your security duties." The accusation hit Thompson like a physical blow. He thought of the hundreds of small moments that had built his relationship with Prince George, the quiet conversations about books, the gentle guidance during overwhelming formal events, the way he had learned to read the boy's moods and provide appropriate support. Had these moments of human connection really been perceived as unprofessional? "Who made this complaint?" Thompson asked, his military training helping him maintain his composure despite the shock. "I'm not at liberty to reveal that information," Sir Edmund replied, though his inability to meet Thompson's eyes suggested his own discomfort with the situation. "What I can tell you is that the complaint has been deemed serious enough to warrant immediate action." Thompson's mind raced through recent interactions, trying to identify what might have triggered such a drastic response. He remembered Prince George's unusual behavior that morning, the boy's cryptic questions about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Had the prince somehow learned about this impending accusation? "Sir, I request the opportunity to address these allegations properly. My service record speaks for itself, and I believe Prince George himself would testify to the appropriateness of my conduct." Sir Edmund's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the man behind the official position. "Sergeant Thompson, off the record, I want you to know that many of us hold you in the highest regard. Your dedication and integrity are unquestioned by those who work with you daily." He paused, struggling with his next words. "However, in matters involving the royal children, even the perception of impropriety must be taken seriously." "What does this mean for my position?" Thompson asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I'm afraid we must ask for your immediate resignation," Sir Edmund said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "You will be provided with an excellent reference and a generous severance package. Your years of faithful service will not be forgotten." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Thompson stood perfectly still, processing the end of a career that had defined him for over 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being dismissed for showing exactly the kind of compassionate professionalism that had made him effective at protecting royal children. "I see," Thompson said finally. "When am I expected to leave?" "Immediately, I'm afraid. Your replacement has already been briefed and will take over your duties effective today. You'll have time to collect your personal belongings and HR will arrange for your final pay and references." Thompson nodded, his military training serving him well in maintaining dignity under fire. "I understand, sir. Might I ask one favor?" "Of course. I would like to say goodbye to Prince George if possible. After 3 years, I believe he deserves an explanation for my sudden absence." Sir Edmund's face showed genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Thompson, but that won't be possible. Clean breaks are considered best in situations like these." The finality of those words hit Thompson harder than the dismissal itself. To disappear from Prince George's life without explanation felt like abandoning the boy, something that went against every instinct he had developed as both a soldier and a protector. "I understand," Thompson said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. As he left Sir Edmund's office, Thompson felt as though he were walking through a dream. The familiar corridors of the castle, which had been his workplace and second home for so many years, suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming. Staff members he had known for years either avoided his gaze or offered sympathetic looks that suggested word of his dismissal had already spread through the household's efficient gossip network. The journey to his quarters to collect his belongings felt like a funeral march. With each step, Thompson found himself thinking not of his own loss, but of how Prince George would react to his unexplained disappearance. The boy had already seemed troubled that morning, as if he had somehow sensed what was coming. As Thompson packed his few personal possessions, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than he understood. The timing, Prince George's unusual behavior, and the vague nature of the complaint all suggested that larger forces were at work. But whatever the truth might be, his immediate reality was clear. His time as Prince George's protector was over. As Thompson made his way through the castle corridors for what he believed would be the last time, carrying a modest box containing his personal belongings, he encountered an unexpected figure. Prince George stood at the intersection of two hallways, positioned in such a way that suggested his presence there was not coincidental. The young prince was no longer in his riding attire, but had changed into a formal dark suit, as if he had prepared himself for an important occasion. The moment their eyes met, Thompson understood that this encounter had been carefully planned by the 11-year-old prince. Despite the household's intention to keep them separated, Prince George had found a way to intercept his departing guard. The boy's expression was solemn, but there was a determination in his stance that reminded Thompson of the prince's father during moments of difficult decision-making. "Sergeant Thompson," Prince George said, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed far beyond his years. Thompson immediately stopped and set down his box, standing at attention despite the circumstances. "Your Highness." "I know what's happening," Prince George said directly, without any of the usual pleasantries that typically marked their conversations. "I know why you're leaving." Thompson felt his heart sink. The idea that this young boy had been burdened with knowledge of adult conspiracies and political maneuvering seemed cruel and unnecessary. "Your Highness, Prince George raised his small hand, and Thompson immediately fell silent. The gesture was so naturally royal, so instinctively commanding, that it reminded Thompson that despite his youth, this boy had been born to lead. "Please don't try to protect me from the truth," Prince George said. "I've heard the conversations. I know about the complaint." His voice wavered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I know it wasn't fair." Thompson struggled to find appropriate words. How could he explain to an 11-year-old that sometimes good people suffered for political reasons they couldn't control? How could he help the boy understand that honor sometimes required accepting unfair treatment without bitterness? "Your Highness, these things happen in life. What matters is how we respond to them." Prince George nodded slowly, as if Thompson's words confirmed something he had already concluded. "That's exactly why I had to find you. I need you to know that what they said about you isn't true. You've been nothing but kind and proper with me. You've made me feel safe when things were scary, and you've treated me like a real person, not just a prince." The sincerity in the boy's voice was heartbreaking. Thompson could see that Prince George had been wrestling with this situation, trying to understand why someone who had been good to him was being punished. The injustice of it clearly bothered the young prince deeply. "Your Highness, your opinion means everything to me. Thank you for saying that." Prince George stepped closer, and Thompson could see that the boy's eyes were bright with unshed tears that he was fighting to control. "I want to do something about this, but I don't know how. I asked Papa about it, but he said it was complicated and that I wouldn't understand." Thompson felt a surge of protectiveness toward the boy, even in his own moment of crisis. "Your Highness, sometimes adults have to make decisions that seem unfair but are meant to protect the people they care about. Your father is trying to protect both you and me, but it's not fair," Prince George said, his young voice cracking slightly. "You're a good person. Good people shouldn't be punished for being good." The simplicity and clarity of the child's moral reasoning was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Thompson realized that this conversation was probably more important for Prince George's development than any formal lesson he might receive about duty or leadership. Your Highness, fairness isn't always possible in this world. What matters is that we continue to do what's right, even when others don't treat us fairly. That's what real honor means. Prince George considered these words carefully, his young mind clearly working through the complex emotions and concepts they represented. After a long moment, he looked up at Thompson with an expression of sudden resolve. "I want to give you something," the prince said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small leather-bound book that Thompson recognized as the prince's personal journal, the one he carried with him during their daily walks. "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Prince George interrupted. "I want you to have it. There's something written inside that I need you to read later, when you're alone." Thompson accepted the journal with trembling hands, understanding that this gift represented something far more significant than a simple keepsake. The weight of the small book seemed to carry the weight of their entire relationship, all the small moments of trust and understanding that had built between them over 3 years. "I will treasure this, Your Highness." Prince George smiled then, though tears were now visible in his eyes. "You taught me that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. You showed me that by how you've always watched over me." The young prince stepped forward and, in a gesture that defied all royal protocol, embraced Thompson briefly. It was a moment of pure human connection that transcended titles and positions, a moment that would remain with Thompson for the rest of his life. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant Thompson," Prince George said as he stepped back, once again the formal young royal. "And remember that I will always be grateful for your service." With that, Prince George turned and walked away, leaving Thompson standing in the corridor with the precious journal in his hands, and the memory of an 11-year-old's wisdom and compassion burning in his heart. Thompson waited until he was safely in his small flat in London before opening Prince George's journal. The modest apartment, which served as his home away from the castle, felt hollow and strange after the day's events. The familiar sounds of London traffic seemed distant and muffled as he sat in his favorite armchair, holding the leather-bound book that represented his final connection to the young prince he had served. His hands shook slightly as he opened the journal to the first page. Prince George's careful handwriting, the product of excellent tutoring, filled the pages with thoughts and observations that revealed a remarkable depth of understanding for someone so young. Thompson found entries about state dinners, family gatherings, and private moments that showed how seriously the boy took his future responsibilities. As he turned the pages, Thompson discovered an entry dated just 2 days earlier that made his breath catch in his throat. "I overheard Papa and some of the household staff talking about Sergeant Thompson today. They were saying things that aren't true about him being too friendly with me. I think someone is trying to get him in trouble, but I don't understand why. Sergeant Thompson has never been anything but kind and proper with me. He helps me when I'm nervous at public events, and he explains things about royal duties that nobody else takes time to explain. He treats me like I matter as a person, not just as a prince. I've been thinking about this all day, and I realize that I need to do something. If I stay quiet while someone good gets hurt, then I'm not being the kind of person I want to be. Mama always says that we have a responsibility to speak up for people who can't speak up for themselves. But what if the people hurting Sergeant Thompson are the same people I'm supposed to obey? I think this is what honor really means. Doing what's right even when it's hard, even when it might get you in trouble. Sergeant Thompson taught me that through his actions, not his words. Now I need to show that I learned the lesson." Thompson's eyes filled with tears as he read the entry. The boy had understood far more than anyone realized, and his moral clarity was both inspiring and heartbreaking. But it was the next entry, dated the morning of Thompson's dismissal, that truly took his breath away. "Today I'm going to do something that might seem wrong to the adults around me, but I know it's right in my heart. I'm going to write a letter to Grandmother and tell her the truth about Sergeant Thompson. I know that if she understands what really happened, she'll make things right. But first I need to make sure Sergeant Thompson knows that he's not alone, that someone sees the truth about who he is. I'm going to give him this journal so he'll know that his kindness wasn't wasted, that it taught me something important about what it means to be a good person. I don't know what will happen after I send the letter. Papa might be angry with me. The household staff might think I'm being disobedient, but I think sometimes being a good prince means standing up to the people around you when they're making bad decisions. Sergeant Thompson would stand up for me if I needed protection. Now I need to stand up for him." Thompson had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the 11-year-old's courage and wisdom. The boy had understood exactly what was happening, and had made a conscious decision to risk his own standing to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. The final entry was dated that very morning. I talked to Sergeant Thompson today, but I couldn't tell him about the letter because I wanted him to read this first. I needed him to understand that his kindness mattered, that it changed me for the better. I hope he'll be proud that he helped teach a future king the difference between following rules and doing what's right. I've learned that real leadership isn't about having people obey you. It's about protecting people who need protection, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. I hope someday I'll be the kind of king that Sergeant Thompson would be proud to serve. I sealed the letter to grandmother this morning. Whatever happens next, I'll know that I tried to do the right thing. Thompson closed the journal and sat in stunned silence. An 11-year-old boy had risked everything to defend him, had written to the Queen herself to challenge the injustice of his dismissal. The courage required for such an action was remarkable in anyone, but in a child who had been raised to follow protocol and defer to adult authority, it was truly extraordinary. The implications of Prince George's actions began to sink in. If the boy had indeed written to Queen Elizabeth, the entire household structure that had engineered Thompson's dismissal would soon face scrutiny from the highest level of the monarchy. The thought both thrilled and terrified Thompson. He wanted his name cleared, but not at the cost of trouble for the brave young prince who had stood up for him. As Thompson sat holding the journal, he realized that regardless of what happened next, something profound had already occurred. Prince George had demonstrated a level of moral courage that many adults never achieved, and he had done it not for personal gain but out of a simple desire to protect someone who had shown him kindness. The boy's actions had revealed the kind of king he might become, one who valued justice over convenience, truth over political expedience, and human dignity over institutional preservation. In trying to save Thompson's career, Prince George had actually demonstrated that his character was already being shaped in exactly the right direction. Thompson carefully closed the journal and held it against his chest, understanding that he had just witnessed something remarkable, the moment when a future king chose honor over obedience, and in doing so, revealed the true nobility of his character. 3 days after Thompson's dismissal, the reverberations of Prince George's letter began to shake the foundations of the royal household. Queen Elizabeth, despite her advanced age, had lost none of her sharp intelligence or her fierce protectiveness of her family's honor. When she received her great-grandson's carefully written letter, delivered through the private channels that royal children use to communicate directly with her, she immediately understood the gravity of the situation. The letter, written in Prince George's precise handwriting, had been both respectful and devastatingly clear. He had explained the circumstances of Thompson's dismissal, provided specific examples of the sergeant's exemplary conduct, and, most importantly, had taken personal responsibility for requesting the Queen's intervention. The boy had concluded his letter with words that would later be quoted in royal circles for years to come. "Grandmother, I believe that how we treat good people when they're in trouble shows what kind of people we really are." Within hours of reading the letter, Queen Elizabeth had summoned Sir Edmund Hartley to a private audience that would become legendary among household staff for its brevity and intensity. Those who witnessed the deputy master of the household emerging from the Queen's private study described him as visibly shaken, carrying himself like a man who had just received the scolding of his lifetime. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Queen Elizabeth personally oversaw the review of Thompson's service record, interviewed staff members who had worked with him, and most crucially, spoke privately with Prince George about his relationship with his former guard. What emerged was a picture that directly contradicted the vague accusations that had led to Thompson's dismissal. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Prince George's private tutor, was among the first to be interviewed. Her testimony was particularly damaging to those who had engineered Thompson's removal. Sergeant Thompson's presence actually improved Prince George's ability to focus during challenging situations, she told the investigators. The boy felt secure knowing Thompson was nearby, which allowed him to engage more fully in his studies and public duties. Their interaction was a model of appropriate professional relationship. Margaret, the head groom, provided similar testimony about Thompson's conduct during riding lessons. In 3 years, I never saw anything but complete professionalism from Sergeant Thompson. If anything, he was more formal than many of the other guards, always ensuring that Prince George understood the proper protocols while still making the boy feel supported. As the investigation deepened, a more troubling picture began to emerge. The original complaint against Thompson had been filed by Lady Victoria Pemberton, a newly appointed advisor to the household who had been pushing for what she called modernization of royal security protocols. Her vision included rotating guard assignments, more frequently to prevent unhealthy attachments between security personnel and royal family members. Lady Pemberton's motivations became clearer when investigators discovered that she had recommended her own nephew for Thompson's position. The complaint against Thompson had been carefully crafted to appear legitimate, while actually serving her personal agenda. She had exploited the household's natural protectiveness toward royal children to remove a dedicated professional and install her own candidate. The revelation of this manipulation sent shockwaves through the royal household. Queen Elizabeth, who had built her long reign on principles of duty and integrity, was reportedly furious that someone had used false accusations to attack a faithful servant, while simultaneously attempting to profit from the deception. Meanwhile, Prince George continued his daily routine with Thompson's replacement, a younger guard named Collins who, while competent, lacked the intuitive understanding that had made Thompson so effective. The prince's tutors and other staff members noticed a change in the boy's demeanor. He was more withdrawn during public events, less willing to engage in casual conversation, and seemed to be constantly watching the adults around him with a new wariness. When Queen Elizabeth spoke privately with Prince George about the situation, she was struck by the boy's maturity in handling such a complex moral dilemma. I asked him if he understood the seriousness of challenging adult authority. She would later confide to Prince William. He told me that he understood it was serious, but that he thought letting good people get hurt by lies was even more serious. The conversation between grandmother and great-grandson lasted for over an hour, covering topics that ranged from the responsibilities of leadership to the importance of standing up for one's convictions. Queen Elizabeth was particularly impressed by Prince George's understanding that his actions might have consequences for himself, but that he had chosen to proceed anyway because he believed it was right. He told me that Sergeant Thompson had taught him that real honor sometimes requires sacrifice, the Queen later recounted. When I asked him what he thought he might be sacrificing, he said his comfortable relationship with the adults who were supposed to guide him. He understood that some people might not trust him as much after this, but he said that was better than not being able to trust himself. The investigation concluded with a formal exoneration of Thompson and a detailed report that exposed the false nature of the original allegations. Lady Pemberton's employment with the royal household was quietly terminated, and new protocols were established to prevent similar abuses of the complaint process. But perhaps most importantly, Queen Elizabeth made a decision that surprised everyone involved. Rather than simply reinstating Thompson to his previous position, she summoned him to a private audience to discuss his future role in the royal household. The call came on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Thompson had left the royal household. He was sitting in his flat, reading the morning papers and trying to adjust to the strange reality of civilian life, when his phone rang with a number he immediately recognized as coming from within the palace. "Sergeant Thompson," came the familiar voice of the Queen's private secretary. "Her Majesty requests your presence at Buckingham Palace at 2 o'clock this afternoon. A car will be sent to collect you." Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he hung up the phone. In all his years of service, he had never been summoned to a private audience with Queen Elizabeth herself. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. This could be either his complete vindication or his final dismissal from royal service forever. He spent the morning preparing himself, mentally, for whatever was to come, polishing his dress uniform one last time, and reviewing everything that had happened in the past week. The journal from Prince George sat on his bedside table, its presence both comforting and overwhelming as he contemplated how an 11-year-old's courage had set these events in motion. The car that arrived to collect him was one of the Queen's personal vehicles, a detail that Thompson noted with growing amazement. As they drove through the gates of Buckingham Palace, he felt as though he were entering a dream. The familiar buildings and courtyards looked different somehow, invested with new significance by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him here. He was escorted to a private sitting room he had never seen before, decorated with personal photographs and comfortable furniture that reflected the Queen's private taste, rather than official protocol. When Queen Elizabeth entered the room, Thompson immediately stood and bowed, but she gestured for him to sit down with a warmth that surprised him. "Sergeant Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne, but also a kindness that put him somewhat at ease. "I believe we have much to discuss." She settled into the chair across from him, and Thompson was struck by how the morning light from the windows illuminated her face, showing both the wisdom of her years and the sharp intelligence that had guided the monarchy through countless crises. "First, I want you to know that the investigation into your dismissal has concluded. You have been completely exonerated of all allegations, and those responsible for the false accusations have been dealt with appropriately." Her tone left no doubt that justice had been served. "Thank you, Your Majesty. The past week has been quite difficult." "I'm sure it has," she replied with genuine sympathy. "But what I find most remarkable about this situation is not the injustice you suffered, but the response it prompted from my great-grandson." Queen Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense. "In over 90 years, I've seen many examples of courage, both on the battlefield and in the corridors of power. But I'm not sure I've ever seen anything quite like an 11-year-old child choosing to challenge adult authority because he believed someone was being treated unfairly." Thompson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Prince George is an extraordinary young man, Your Majesty. His sense of justice and fairness is remarkable." "Yes, it is," the Queen agreed. "But he didn't develop those qualities in isolation. Someone taught him, through example, what it means to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Someone showed him that real honor sometimes requires personal sacrifice." The implication of her words was clear, and Thompson felt overwhelmed by the understanding that his relationship with Prince George had been recognized not as a professional failing, but as a profound success, Your Majesty. I was simply doing my job to the best of my ability. No, Sergeant Thompson, you were doing much more than that. You were helping to shape the character of a future king, and you did so with such integrity that when faced with injustice, he chose to emulate your example rather than accept it passively. Queen Elizabeth paused, studying Thompson's face with the keen attention she had perfected over decades of reading people's character. "Which brings me to why I asked you here today. I have a proposition for you." Thompson waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I would like to offer you a new position within the royal household, not as a guard, but as a special advisor on security matters relating to the younger generation of royals. Your role would involve helping to train other security personnel in the delicate balance between protection and personal development that royal children require." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Thompson struggled to process it. "Your Majesty, I'm honored beyond words. The position would also involve continued interaction with Prince George and his siblings, though in a different capacity. You would help oversee their security education, teaching them how to balance their need for protection with their desire for normal experiences." Thompson realized that this was more than just a job offer. It was a recognition that his relationship with Prince George had been valuable, that the human connection that had led to his dismissal was actually being celebrated and institutionalized. "I believe," Queen Elizabeth continued, "that what happened this week has taught us all something important. The rigid protocols that were meant to protect our family sometimes prevent the very relationships that help our children develop into the kind of leaders they need to become." She stood, and Thompson immediately rose as well. "I hope you'll accept this position, Sergeant Thompson. I believe my great-grandson has much more to learn from you, and I suspect you have much more to teach." As they shook hands, Thompson understood that Prince George's wordless decision to stand up for justice had not only changed his own life but had also prompted a quiet revolution in how the royal household thought about the relationship between duty and humanity. "Thank you, Your Majesty. It would be my honor to continue serving the royal family." Later that afternoon, when Thompson was reunited with Prince George in the castle gardens, no words were needed between them. The boy's smile and brief, respectful nod conveyed everything that needed to be said about honor, courage, and the power of doing what's right even when it's difficult. Their relationship had been tested by injustice and had emerged stronger, transformed from that of guard and charge into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that sometimes the most important lessons are taught and learned through actions rather than words.